It was Holy Saturday, April 16th, 1960, in McAllen, Texas, a small city near the Mexican border where the Rio Grande Valley meets endless cotton fields and citrus groves. 25-year-old Irene Garza had plans that evening. Sacred Heart Catholic Church was holding confessions before Easter Sunday, and Irene, deeply devout, never missed the sacraments. She borrowed her father's car around sunset, told her parents she'd be back soon. She was just going to confession. What could be safer than a church on the holiest weekend of the year? Irene Garza was everything her community admired. A second-grade teacher at an underprivileged elementary school. Former Miss All South Texas Sweetheart, 1958. The first Hispanic drum majorette at McAllen High School. The first person in her family to earn a college degree. She was beautiful, accomplished, and kind in ways that went beyond surface charm. She'd spent her first teaching paycheck buying books and clothes for her students, children whose families couldn't afford them. And she was devout, profoundly, sincerely Catholic in a way that shaped every part of her life. She volunteered with the Legion of Mary, attended Mass regularly, went to confession not out of obligation but out of genuine faith. That faith led her to Sacred Heart Church on April 16, 1960, and she never came home. By 3 a.m. on Easter Sunday, when Irene still hadn't returned, her father Nicholas Garza called police. Something was wrong. Irene would never stay out all night without calling. She'd never miss Easter services with her family. Officers found the family car parked 2 blocks from Sacred Heart. Irene's brother-in-law had already discovered it hours earlier and driven it home, hoping whoever had given Irene a ride would eventually drop her off. But nobody came. And as Easter Sunday dawned bright and warm, Irene Garza was missing. 5 days later, on April 21st, her body was pulled from an irrigation canal near Business 83 and 2nd Street in McAllen. She was fully dressed, except for her shoes and underwear. Her lavender blouse had been unbuttoned. She was lying face down in the water, partially decomposed. The autopsy revealed she'd been beaten with a hard object, severe bruising around both eyes and the right side of her face. She'd been sexually assaulted while unconscious, and she'd been suffocated, likely with a plastic bag or similar material placed over her head. According to her death certificate, she'd been raped while in a coma. The last person confirmed to have seen Irene Garza alive was a 27-year-old priest named Father John Bernard Fite. He'd heard her confession that Saturday evening. In the rectory, he later admitted, not in a traditional confessional booth, but face-to-face in the church office, highly unusual for the time. The investigation into Irene's murder was immediate and extensive. Hundreds of witnesses interviewed. Volunteers searched fields and irrigation canals. The community was horrified. Violent crime was rare in McAllen, and the murder of a beloved schoolteacher shocked everyone. Suspicion fell quickly on Father John Fite. Multiple parishioners reported that his confession line had moved unusually slowly on Holy Saturday, that he'd been away from the sanctuary several times that evening, that when he heard confessions, he seemed distracted, agitated. Fellow priests noticed scratches on the backs of his hands after Easter Vigil Mass. When questioned, Fite claimed he'd gotten them from a cat, or maybe working outside. His explanations varied. When police drained the irrigation canal where Irene's body had been found, they discovered a green slide viewer, a small device for viewing photographic slides. It belonged to Father John Fite. He admitted ownership in a note to police. How did his slide viewer end up at the site where a murdered woman's body was dumped? Fite had no good answer. Then investigators learned something that should have sealed the case. Just 3 weeks before Irene's murder, another young woman had been attacked inside a church. Maria America Guerra, 20 years old, had been kneeling at the communion rail in a Catholic church in nearby Edinburgh when a man grabbed her from behind, attempted to drag her away. She fought back, managed to escape. She described her attacker as resembling a priest, dark clothing, nervous demeanor. After Irene's murder, when police showed Maria a lineup of photos, she identified Father John Fite as the man who'd assaulted her. Fite was charged with attempted rape in the Garza case. The trial ended in a hung jury. Some jurors couldn't bring themselves to believe a priest could commit such a crime. Rather than face a second trial, Fite pleaded no contest to aggravated assault. He paid a $500 fine. No jail time, no further consequences. Police also gave Fite a polygraph test regarding Irene Garza's murder. The examiner's initial assessment was clear. Fite was lying when he denied killing her. The results definitely implicated him in the crime, but the official report was later changed to say the results were inconclusive. The examiner would later testify he'd always believed Fite had failed the test, but someone had altered his conclusions. Despite all this evidence, the scratches, the slide viewer, the assault on Maria Garza, the failed polygraph, John Fite was never charged with Irene Garza's murder. Rumors spread through McAllen about why. Whispers of a deal between the Catholic Church and local authorities, fear of prosecuting a priest in an overwhelmingly Catholic community, political calculations around religion and power. Whatever the reason, Father John Fite left McAllen, left the Rio Grande Valley, and the case went cold. After leaving McAllen, Father John Fite was sent to monasteries, first to New Melleray Abbey in Dubuque, Iowa, then to Assumption Abbey in Ava, Missouri. At Assumption Abbey in 1963, Fite was assigned to work with a monk named Dale Tacheny, who was responsible for counseling new arrivals. During those counseling sessions, Fite confessed. Not in the sacramental sense. This wasn't confession in a confessional booth. This was one man telling another what he'd done, what he couldn't forget, what haunted him. According to Tacheny's later testimony, Fite described attacking a young woman during Easter weekend 1960. Described using a cellophane bag to suffocate her. Described putting her in a bathtub, then later transporting her body and dumping it in a canal. I was told that he had killed a woman, Tacheny would later tell investigators, and then ask if we could see if he would fit in the monastery and possibly become a monk. A murderer becoming a monk. The abbey superiors knew what Fite had done, or at least suspected it, and still welcomed him. Tacheny was troubled by what he'd heard, but he stayed silent, kept the secret for decades. Another priest, Father Joseph O'Brien, who'd been assistant pastor at Sacred Heart Church in McAllen when Irene disappeared, also later came forward with a similar admission. Fite had confessed to him as well, shortly after the murder. For 40 years, these men of God knew what John Fite had done, and they said nothing. Meanwhile, Fite left the monastery system and went to work for the Servants of the Paraclete in Jemez Springs, New Mexico, a treatment center for troubled priests. He eventually rose to a supervisory position there, making decisions about when sexually abusive priests could return to active ministry. One of those priests was James Porter, who would later be convicted of molesting more than 100 children across multiple states. Fite had cleared him for parish placement. In the early 1970s, John Fite left the priesthood entirely. He married, moved to Scottsdale, Arizona, raised 3 children, and volunteered for 17 years at the Society of St. Vincent de Paul, a Catholic charity. From the outside, he looked like a reformed man, a family man, a grandfather living quietly in suburban Arizona. Irene Garza's family, meanwhile, still had no answers, no justice, just the knowledge that somewhere the man who'd killed their daughter was living free. In 2002, Dale Tacheny decided he could no longer carry the weight of what he knew. He was older now, retired, no longer bound by institutional loyalties or fears about challenging church authority. He wrote to police. Not to McAllen. He mistakenly believed the murder had occurred in San Antonio, where Fight had trained. But the letter eventually found its way to the right investigators. Texas Ranger Rudy Jaramillo took the lead. Contacted Father Joseph O'Brien, who initially denied knowing anything, then admitted Fight had confessed to him as well. The case was reopened. McAllen Police Chief Victor Rodriguez became personally invested in finding justice for Irene, treating the decades-old case with the same urgency as if it had happened yesterday. But there was a problem. Hidalgo County District Attorney Irene Garza. Garza had been DA since the 1980s. He was hesitant to pursue Fight, citing the age of the case, the lack of DNA evidence, the difficulty of proving murder based on confessions made to priests decades earlier. In 2004, under pressure to do something, Garza presented the case to a grand jury. But he never called Dale Tacheny to testify, never called Joseph O'Brien, never presented the strongest evidence he had. The grand jury declined to indict Fight. The case went cold again. Father O'Brien died in 2005. Most people assumed that was the end, that John Fight would die a free man, that Irene Garza's family would never see justice. But in 2014, a new district attorney ran for office on a platform that included one clear promise. He would pursue justice for Irene Garza. His name was Ricardo Rodriguez. He won the election, and he meant what he'd said. On February 9, 2016, in Scottsdale, Arizona, police arrested an 83-year-old man at his home. John Bernard Fight was charged with the murder of Irene Garza, 56 years after her death. Reporters who covered the arrest described a frail, elderly man needing assistance to walk, looking confused and frightened. His family was shocked. His children, who'd grown up not knowing their father had once been a suspect in a murder, struggled to reconcile the grandfather they knew with the accusations. Fight was extradited to Texas, held in Hidalgo County Jail while awaiting trial. The trial was set for September 2017, 57 years after Irene Garza had walked into Sacred Heart Church for confession and never walked out. Many legal experts doubted the prosecution could win. The case was ancient. Physical evidence had degraded. Key witnesses were dead or very old. There was no DNA, no confession in the legal sense, no smoking gun. But prosecutors had something powerful. The testimony of Dale Tacheny, now in his 80s, willing to tell a jury what John Fight had confessed to him in 1963. And they had the pattern: the attack on Maria Guerra, the scratches on Fight's hands, the slide viewer found at the dump site, the 40 years of suspicious behavior and institutional protection. The trial began on November 30th, 2017. The courtroom in Edinburgh, Texas was packed. Irene's family sat in the front rows, cousins, nephews, nieces. The generation that had known her was mostly gone, but those who remained carried their grief and determination forward. Prosecutors painted a methodical picture. Irene had come to confession. Fight had heard it in the rectory, unusual even for 1960. At some point, whether during the confession or after, he'd attacked her, beaten her unconscious, assaulted her while she was in a coma. Then, he'd hidden her body, possibly in the pastoral house at a nearby shrine, before dumping it in the irrigation canal days later, when decomposition would make time of death harder to determine. Dale Tacheny, now 90 years old, took the stand. His testimony was devastating. He described Fight's admission in detail: the cellophane bag, the bathtub, the panic of trying to hide what he'd done, the transportation of the body. Defense attorneys argued that Tachney's memory was unreliable after so many decades, that he might be confused, might be seeking attention, might be lying. But Tachney was calm, consistent, unshakable. This was not a man seeking fame. This was a man unburdening his conscience before he died. The defense portrayed Fite as a frail, sick old man being persecuted for crimes he didn't commit, argued that the real killer had never been found, that the evidence against Fite was circumstantial, that a young priest's career had been destroyed by rumors and suspicion. Assistant District Attorney Irene Garza held up a photo of Irene in his closing arguments. "Some people," he said, "may not understand why we're prosecuting an old man. But make no mistake, this is an evil man. He was a predator, a wolf in priest's clothing." He asked the jury to sentence Fite to 57 years in prison, 1 year for every year of freedom he'd enjoyed while Irene lay dead. On December 7, 2017, after roughly 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. Guilty. Murder with malice aforethought. John Bernard Fite, 85 years old, sat stone-faced, showed no emotion. The next day, the jury sentenced him to life in prison. Irene Garza's family wept in the courtroom, hugged the prosecutors, thanked Police Chief Rodriguez, who'd never stopped fighting for justice. Linda de la Vigna, Irene's cousin, had waited her entire adult life for this moment. She'd been a young woman when Irene was murdered, had spent decades pushing authorities to act, had been told repeatedly, including by former DA Irene Garza, that she would never get an indictment. Now, at last, she had it. Not just an indictment, but a conviction. John Fite filed an appeal, claiming hearsay evidence and procedural errors. But he would never leave prison to see the appeal resolved. On February 11, 2020, at 5 a.m., guards at the Telford unit in New Boston, Texas, found Fite unresponsive in his cell. He was pronounced dead at Huntsville Hospital at 5:38 a.m. The preliminary cause of death was cardiac arrest. He was 87 years old, had served just over 2 years of his life sentence. Dale Tachney, the monk whose testimony had helped convict Fite, died the previous month at age 90. He'd carried the secret for more than half a century before finally speaking. His courage to testify, despite his age and despite the weight of guilt he carried for staying silent so long, had been crucial to the conviction. Irene Garza would have been 85 years old in 2020 if she'd lived. Would have had a career spanning decades. Might have married, had children and grandchildren of her own. Might have retired from teaching, traveled, grown old watching the Rio Grande Valley change around her. Instead, she stayed forever 25. Forever the beautiful young teacher in the photographs. Forever the woman who'd walked into a church and never walked out. The murder of Irene Garza is a story about many things. About a predator who wore a collar and used faith as a weapon. About institutional protection of abusers. About a family that refused to give up. About justice that came so late it felt almost meaningless. But it's also a story about the specific horror of betrayed trust. Irene Garza went to confession, one of the most sacred acts in Catholic practice. The moment when you're most vulnerable, most honest, most trusting that the person hearing your sins will protect rather than harm you. And the man who heard her confession murdered her. It's difficult to calculate the full damage John Fite caused, not just to Irene, though her stolen life is incalculable loss enough, but to everyone who trusted him afterward. The parishioners at churches where he served, the troubled priests he supervised at Jemez Springs, including James Porter, whom Fite cleared to return to ministry despite knowing what Porter would do to children. The decades of fear in McAllen, where parents wondered if their daughters were safe going to church. The erosion of trust in an institution that had protected a murderer rather than face scandal. The family members who waited 57 years for justice, many of them dying before seeing Fite convicted. Is justice still justice when it comes this late? When the perpetrator is an old man? When most of the witnesses are dead? When the victim's parents never lived to see conviction? The answer is yes. Because justice isn't just about punishment, it's about truth. About saying clearly, officially, that what happened was wrong, that Irene Garza mattered, that her life had value and her death demands acknowledgement. John Fite got to live a full life, got to leave the priesthood, marry, raise children, see his grandchildren, got 57 years of freedom that Irene Garza never had. But in the end, his name is recorded in history not as Father Fite, respected priest, but as John Bernard Fite, convicted murderer. And Irene Garza is remembered not just as a victim, but as the woman whose family never gave up, whose case became a symbol for why cold cases matter, why institutional cover-ups must be challenged. So remember Irene Garza, not just for how she died, but for how she lived, teaching children, giving back to her community, practicing her faith with sincere devotion. And remember that sometimes, even after 57 years, the truth finds its way out, even when powerful institutions try to bury it. Thank you for watching this video. Sleep well. And remember, some confessions are never forgotten.